This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. For those who spend their time fixing things, saving things, preserving things, the investment of time, resources, emotional and intellectual capital are great. The work can be tiresome, it can be frustrating, it can be taxing, and at times physically demanding. And we embark upon these projects hoping that the end result will be worth it. That once we have invested all of ourselves, the project will turn around and give us something to marvel at. An object that can sustain, has a new lease on life, and has the power to now affect others. But there must be something more, for all of that work and energy expended must deliver its own reward, else everything rests upon the final product. And in the best of times, that journey, that investment of time and energy that sometimes seems so pointless, can deliver its own rewards. This painting has seen better days for sure. A cursory glance, and we can see the paint barely attached to the canvas, flaking throughout, in some areas already gone. The painting is yellowed with a discolored natural resin varnish and a heavy layer of surface grime atop, both defying what the artist intended us to see. A closer examination reveals the telltale signs of poor historic interventions, areas where the flaking paint was crudely stabilized with oil paint, and the retouching haphazardly smeared across the surface. These are not only poor restorations, they break the image as well, drawing our attention away from the composition and the brushwork to the damage itself, some places barely, and some as if they were gaping wounds. This painting will require a massive investment of work, time, energy, intellectual and emotional capital. And on the other side, I hope that the result will be worth it, that the client will be overtaken with joy, that I will be satisfied with what has come of my time and labor. But more than just that, I have to trust that as I work to save this painting, give it a new lease on life, this painting will reciprocate, and the journey will provide both of us with salvation. You know, there are some things that just don't deserve to be saved, like that old website you've been hanging on to. But with Squarespace's new design intelligence software, you can build a beautiful, mobile-friendly, and modern website just by dragging and dropping elements around the page. So what you see is what you get. No coding necessary. And by utilizing Squarespace's new AI engine, you can take some of the drudgery out of adding copy to your website, letting the AI enhance it, edit it, make it more clear, or just give it a little bit of personality. And Squarespace's support doesn't just stop on the design end. With robust forums, tutorials, videos, and articles, anything and everything you could ever ask has already been answered. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. After removing the painting from the frame and from behind that cloudy and unnecessary glass, I was able to get a better look at this piece, and, well, it doesn't look any better now that I can see it more clearly. In fact, it looks a little bit worse, but that's just par for the course. First thing I need to do is separate the canvas from this stretcher support, and this is done by removing all of these old and rusty tacks. But upon closer examination, these are not tacks, these are nails. And these are ring shank nails, where the shank of the nail has ribs or rings on it, which keep it in place, making it exponentially harder to remove each one of these nails, much to my chagrin. This is not the first time that I've seen this, and it certainly won't be the last time. And judging from how this painting was treated in the past during these ill-fated conservation attempts, it is no surprise that the wrong fasteners were used. Once I have removed all of these nails, I can start peeling back this canvas from the stretcher. And there's really barely any canvas holding it on. The tacking edges are almost completely gone. You can see that they're heavily deteriorated, and where the nails have rusted, the canvas has gone with it. So it wasn't terribly difficult. I'm being really careful here because the paint is so fragile, and every time I move it, I can hear it crack. So before I do any more treatments, I'm going to apply a facing to this painting. And this is one of those instances where the facing is more than just precautionary support. Because this paint layer is so fragile, if I didn't put this facing on, I can guarantee that the paint would flake off. And that certainly wouldn't be good for me, the painting, or the client. By using fish gelatin, I can bond this very thin piece of Japanese mulberry paper to the surface. The fish gelatin is heated up and thinned out to a consistency that penetrates through this paper, and then when it's dry, it will be securely bonded to the face. This can be removed later on. This is not a permanent adhesive. And in terms of some of the adhesives we use, the fish gelatin has a lower adhesion bond than, say, rabbit skin glue or hide glue, and certainly less than the synthetic glues that we use. But the reason we use this adhesive with this mulberry paper is because when the paper is wet and soft, it conforms really well to the texture of the paint. You can see how it's just marrying itself right to the surface, giving a good purchase and making sure that nothing goes anywhere. It takes about a day or so for the adhesive to dry, and then I can come back and handle this painting with a little bit more confidence that nothing's going to get lost. And here we can start looking at the back and peeling off some of these, well, patches, I guess. This just looks like fabric. It doesn't look like canvas. Probably something that was lying around and somebody thought, well, let's just glue this to the back. It's a quick fix. Over time, the adhesive that they've used and the fabric has deteriorated, becoming very brittle and rather easy to remove. Using a scalpel, I can slide under the fabric and then just peel it off. I'll continue with the scalpel to remove any remnants that are on the back, and then I'll deal with the adhesive later. The big patches are no less easy to remove, they just take a little bit more time. I'm peeling them off in small sections because that's how the fabric wants to come off. If it comes off in one big piece, well, that's great for me, but it really doesn't matter. All of it's got to go eventually. I'll clean off the back with a brush. I'm not terribly worried about the gunk and the grime that's on there right now. I'm going to have to go over this painting multiple times to clean off the back. You can see how embedded some of this gunk is. In fact, it's so embedded that I need to use my scalpel to scrape it off. How about that for some tenacious dust? While I have my scalpel handy, I'm going to go across the entire back of the painting and remove anywhere where the original gesso layer penetrated through the canvas, where there's glue on the back, or even where there are little slubs or imperfections in the canvas. Because when I put this painting on the hot table, any of those imperfections or foreign matter that's on the back will transfer to the front of the painting and create a divot, and we certainly don't want that. And now it's off to the hot table for the first of many treatments. The table has been heated up, so it's already warm. I'll lay the painting down on a nylon release film that allows air and moisture to pass through from the painting to the cotton blotter paper that's below it, which will absorb any of that ambient moisture. And then I put some silicone release film on the surface of the painting, just as a precautionary measure, and then cover it all with another piece of Mylar or PET film. Install the through bag connectors to extract all of the air out of this little envelope that I've taped down, and now we have the painting receiving its first treatment. we can see that the surface of the painting is still very textured with heavy cracks. And I'm going to go over with my bone folder and just give a little bit of encouragement to the surface of the painting to lay flat. I'll switch over to a roller to get a little bit more purchase, then back to the bone folder for detailed work, maybe back to the roller, so on and so forth. Once the painting has been allowed to sit in the heat for a little while, I'll turn off the heat, let it cool, bring it to room temperature, and then transfer it over to another table where it will go under weights for a couple of days to acclimatize to the studio's relative humidity. Even though I didn't add any moisture to this painting, the canvas still holds on to ambient moisture, and if I don't press this, it's going to distort. And in that distortion, the paint could flake off, something I don't want. As with so many procedures, waiting is the name of the game. And allowing the painting to sit over the weekend, it's now ready to come out from underneath these weights. It's a fairly simple system I have set up here, but it works. It doesn't need to be terribly complicated. And look at that, no distortion, nice and smooth. And even those cracks came down quite a bit. So now it is time to remove that facing. One of the benefits of putting the painting on the hot table is that any size that's in the original canvas, when it's heated up and the ambient moisture becomes free, will soften up and help bond that paint back down to the canvas. Now, it's not as good as the synthetic adhesives that I may use later on, but this does a good job of at least providing me some temporary support until I'm ready to get to that procedure. Now, I mentioned removing the fish gelatin. This is done with warm water, a brush, and a little palette knife in some areas where it's a little bit more tenacious than others. Using that warm water, I'll then go over the surface of the painting a few times to pick up any residues of that adhesive, because if I don't, the solvents that I need to remove the varnish won't be able to reach the varnish. You see, any fish gelatin that's sitting on the surface will act as a barrier layer for those solvents, and they won't make it through to the varnish, and then I won't be able to remove that varnish. So that's why I need to take all of that residue off. Now at this point, I'm going to remove this patch, which appears to be remnants of a German newspaper, and I'll save this for the clients. I'm not sure they want it, but it's novel, and maybe somebody who reads German can tell me what was going on that day in the little town. But of course now there's a huge gap, and I'm going to fill it in with a piece of canvas from my canvas stock. Anytime I take a lining off of an old painting, if the canvas is salvageable, not too brittle or too damaged, I'll save it so that I can use it for inlays. The varying canvas weights, colors, textures, weaves are a great resource to have to match when I need a piece like this. So once I've traced it out, I'll inlay it and we can see just how it fits. But of course, this inlay is just free floating, and as I maneuver the painting, it will become dislodged and possibly lost. So I'm taking very thin strips of that same mulberry paper, and using a little bit of conservation grade adhesive, I'm just laying them down over the edges. And this will do a couple of things for me. One, it will make sure that this inlay isn't lost as I handle the painting. And two, because there is no physical bond between the edges of the original canvas and the inlay, it could potentially move over time. And this little bit of paper will hold them in place. So, now that we've done the first step in the structural repair, we can now do the second, and that's preparing this painting for its interleafed lining. And this is a treatment that I do quite often when paintings are heavily damaged. When the canvas is no longer able to support itself for various reasons, water damage, pest infestation, deterioration, or because there are massive holes and tears, like in this case, we need to add some structural support. Because the adhesive I use is flexible, we can't just line this painting to a piece of canvas, because all of the distortions will manifest themselves on the front of the painting. If I were using a rigid adhesive, something like the historic rabbit skin glue, then we wouldn't need to put in this interleaf. But because I use modern synthetic and fully reversible adhesives, we have some compromises. And to address that compromise, I do what's called an interleaf. And it's where we create a sandwich in between the original painting and the lining canvas of a piece of flat-spun nylon gossamer and a piece of rigid PET film, effectively putting a sheet of plastic in between the canvas and the lining canvas. And what this does is provide rigidity, and it immobilizes this canvas so that as the humidity changes, it won't move. The repairs won't open up. Nothing will fail, and it will last for a very, very long time. Once I've prepared all those materials, I can tack everything together to make sure it doesn't shift as I'm walking back to the hot table, and then we can do the lining procedure. And this is done on the vacuum table as opposed to with an iron, because we want to apply even heat across the entire piece all at once, and then cool it at the same rate all at once. If you've ever ironed anything, you know that you can sometimes chase your own tail, ironing out a wrinkle in one spot, but then creating one in another. And while that may be okay for a shirt, it's not okay for a painting. Those wrinkles and waves can get embedded into the painting, and then we have bigger problems. So by using the heated aluminum table, we can make sure that all of the painting gets heated up at the same rate and cooled at the same rate and under even pressure, so there's no distortion at all, which, for a painting, is really what we want. And come to think of it, maybe for our shirts too, but that's a project for another day. Again, I'm using the bone folder to encourage those cracks a little bit flatter. With the structural integrity of the painting now secured, I can turn my attention to the front and the aesthetic issues that we have to address, namely cleaning this thing, getting rid of all of this grime and yellowed varnish. After making some tests when I examined the painting, I mixed up a solvent solution that will remove the varnish without harming the underlying paint layer. And using a little hand-rolled swab, we can see just how special this painting is going to be when it's finally cleaned. cleaning revealed some really beautiful colors, it also laid bare all of that sloppy and discolored overpainting. And this is a prime example of why we don't use oil paint anymore. This may have matched at one point, but it discolored over time, and now it doesn't look so good. Now to remove this, I can choose any number of techniques. I can choose mechanical with a scalpel, or chemical with a solvent mixture in a gel form. And ultimately, both are going to help me here. I'll apply the solvent gel and I'll let it sit. And then I'll lift it off with a swab and reveal just how much overpaint there really is. You can see that something like this little hole, well, they just kind of went crazy and overpainted the whole hand. I'm going to have to fix this because it doesn't look right and we can do better. Now after the first round of solvent removal, I'll turn to a scalpel and I'll just try to scrape back as much of this as I can. Now unfortunately, when it comes to removing old overpaint, sometimes the overpaint is so old and so oxidized and cross-linked that it just won't come off. And in that case, like we have here, we try to remove as much as we can to reveal what was underneath, knowing that we're going to have to do extensive retouching to repair all of that damage. The painting is now ready for the next phase of conservation, where we start putting it back together. Heretofore, we've been removing and undoing a lot of stuff, but now we can start thinking about how we make this piece complete, how we save it. And it begins by filling in the areas of loss. On this area right here, there was no paint, so we put some fill-in material so that we have a surface onto which we can retouch. And in the big area, well, we have to put a lot of fill-in material. This painting has almost no impasto, and that's the textural buildup of paint that sometimes artists use. So here we just have to make sure it's really smooth. Once I've added that fill-in material and allowed it to dry, I can come back with some swabs and start removing all of the excess. When I filled it in, I was liberal to say the least. I didn't really care if it was neat because I know that I can come back and remove it. Now here I'm using a sanding sponge, a 320 grit sanding sponge, so one that's very, very smooth. And I'm not looking to remove it from the painting. What I'm looking to do is knock down some of those tool marks. I used a trowel and it created little lines, and I want to get those down, so I use the sanding sponge. And then back to swabs, removing a little bit, checking, removing a little bit more, checking again. And sometimes I'll have to add more fill-in material in the removal process because, well, I removed too much, or I'm just not satisfied with how much I previously built up. Once all of that's removed, I can then return the painting to its support. Now this stretcher was cleaned, all of the grime and dust and dirt and old paper tape and rabbit skin glue were scrubbed off, and it was examined to make sure that there were no cracks or other damage that would warrant repair. I'm going to square it up using a square and some nails in the corners to make sure that it stays in place. By putting 2 in each corner, it effectively makes it much more rigid and less prone to distorting and turning into a parallelogram as I handle it. I'll return the painting onto the support, I'll size it up, make sure it's oriented how I like, and then I'll use some tacks to secure this painting to the support. Now you'll notice that I didn't use nails. Nails are not correct for paintings. We want tacks. Tacks hold the painting onto the support very well, but they can also be removed. So unlike a ring shank nail, which will rust and break apart and gives the conservator a lot of headache, tacks can come out a little bit easier. I don't have to worry too much about adding tension to this painting while I'm stretching it because the interleafed lining has effectively made it immobile. Remember, that's one of the reasons we did it. So I can't really add too much tension. Even if I pulled really hard, there's only a minimal amount that would be added, and that's mostly in the tacking edge. So I just need to make sure that it's centered and it's aligned how I like, and then I can just simply go ahead and tack it. The corners will get folded and tucked in. The nails that held it square will be removed, and then all of this excess canvas will be trimmed off. It's a lot easier to trim it off after we stretch it than it is to do it beforehand. Then, using some smaller tacks, these don't need to be structural, they're just holding down canvas, I'll tack this canvas in place, and I'll tuck in all the corners so that it looks nice and tidy, and that we have a good strong overlap in these corners so that they don't tear or become frayed. And once the stretching is complete, I'll add the keys into each corner and hammer them down. Now, even though I'm not looking to add any tension to this painting and take up any slack, the keys help hold the stretcher together. That's why I add them in. And as always, I'm going to bind them in place with some fishing line and another tack to make sure that they don't get lost or slide down in between the canvas. Now, as I was preparing for retouching, I decided that I wasn't quite satisfied with that fill-in on that large area. It was too smooth, and I feared that it would just become this flat area that your eye was drawn to. So I'm going to start adding some texture to it. I used a little bit of cheesecloth to create the illusion of canvas weave. Now, I can't create canvas weave, but I can create the illusion of it. And so by pressing some of that fill in through the cheesecloth, I get that grid that kind of resembles canvas weave. But I'm not done yet. There were a couple of brush strokes that did have a little bit of impasto in her hair. And so I'm taking some gesso and I'm just going to kind of paint them in on top of this canvas texture to carry through this line right here. And then of course, I'm going to go and scratch in some cracks because the painting was cracked. And if I don't add these, well, you're going to see a smooth spot. Adding these cracks physically is going to give a little bit more depth than if I were just to add them with paint. Now, in some areas, we can paint in the cracks because they're so fine, but in this case, I wanted them to be textural. Now, before any retouching, I'm going to add this isolation layer to saturate the paint, make it look rich and vibrant. Right now, it's really washed out and dry looking, but once I add this layer of synthetic resin, well, the painting comes alive, and that's what I want to retouch according to. You can see what would happen if I retouched according to that washed out red, and then I applied a varnish. Well, it just wouldn't look right. So this helps me match my colors accurately. With all of the retouching now complete, it's time for the final varnish, which will do a couple of things. It will protect the painting from UV light and from fingerprints and dust and grime, but it also allows me to control the sheen, make the painting glossier or more matte, depending on how I and the client want the painting to look. I'll brush it on with a thick bristle brush, and then work the surface. As the varnish is drying, I'll continue to brush it out so that we get a really beautiful velvety texture. And then that's it. Well, almost. The painting needs to go back in the frame. We've omitted the glass because now we have the ultraviolet stable varnish and the glass is totally unnecessary. The client also wanted the glass removed. Using some offset brackets, not nails, I'll secure the painting in place, and then I'll mark my label with what materials I used, and then we're done. To say this painting underwent a radical transformation would be a gross understatement. While certainly the same image, its presence is now commanding. Free from all of that surface grime and yellowed varnish, a world of colors has been revealed. With all of the surface cracks now gone, we can see the image and the composition, not just the surface. And after healing all the wounds from the past conservation attempts, we no longer see them as scars violating the artist's intent. While it probably goes without saying that the time and intellectual and emotional capital invested into this painting has yielded dividends, for my client and for myself, it bears repeating that the work has value. In rising to the challenge, in overcoming the obstacles, in staying focused and disciplined, and working methodically through this project, without becoming deterred or losing my way. This process has taught me something. And while I may have given a new lease on life to this painting, while I may have saved it, the lessons that I'll take away from this project may have given me more than I've given the painting. I guess, for both of us, a small dose of salvation.